Have you ever returned to a place you thought you'd outgrown, only to find it had been waiting for you all along? In the heart of a sleepy town, beneath a sky just beginning to breathe morning light, she opened her violin case. No stage, no spotlight, just cobblestone beneath her feet, and silence. But then she played one note, then another, and the entire town paused. Coffee cups stopped mid-air. Conversations fell quiet. Even the breeze seemed to hold its breath, because sometimes the most powerful journey is the one where you come home to yourself. This is not just a story about a bus ride. It's about memory music. And the moment your heart finally whispers, "I'm ready to belong again," the street was quiet, just the kind of quiet that settles softly at the edge of town when late afternoon folds into twilight. Claire stood alone at the bus stop, her hands tucked into the sleeves of her sweater, her emerald violin case resting gently by her feet. She wasn't in a hurry. She never was at this hour. This moment, just before the night unfolded, was her favorite part of the day. Above her, the sky shimmered in muted metallic tones, a soft silver gray stretching like silk across the rooftops. A breeze threaded through the trees behind her, crisp and cool, with a hint of mint, like freshly brewed tea left out in the open. The wind whispered promises of rain. Somewhere in the distance, a set of church bells chimed their notes, floating down the street like ripples in still water. Claire closed her eyes and breathed in slowly. Birdsong flickered in the air like candlelight, sweet, spontaneous, and full of life. Sparrows flitted from fence posts to branches, then perched on the wire above, chirping, as if they had secrets to share. Claire smiled softly to herself. She'd always found something magical in small things: birdsong leaves in the wind, the shimmer of dusk across stone sidewalks. She adjusted her brown satchel and knelt down, pulling a tiny paper bag of sea salt chips from inside. She nibbled a few, then poured the rest into her open palm and lowered her hand to the ground. The sparrows grew quiet, curious. One hopped forward. Another tilted its head, as if to say, "Are you sure Claire didn't move?" She just smiled. A bold little one fluttered down and landed in her hand. It was lighter than she expected, just a soft, warm presence in her palm. Its feathers tickled her skin like whispers. For a moment, everything felt suspended. It was a moment without time, no past, no future. Just stillness. Just breath. Then came the soft honk of the bus. The spell broke, but not in a bad way. It simply shifted like a lullaby, moving into its next verse. Claire stood, slowly brushed off her skirt, and made sure she had everything: her satchel, her violin, and her folded scarf. As she stepped toward the bus, she glanced once more at the quiet street. The air had changed, and so had she. The bus doors opened with a sigh, and Claire climbed aboard. She found her favorite window seat near the back on the left side, where the views of the countryside were best once the city gave way to fields. As the driver shifted gears and the bus rolled forward, Claire pressed her forehead gently against the cool glass. She loved bus rides at night. There was something so soothing about moving while staying still. It was like floating, like the earth was tucking you in and carrying you home. The city slid by in warm, flickering flashes. Headlights, corner shops, a woman on a bike with groceries in her basket. Then the buildings grew farther apart, and street lights grew fewer. Trees began to edge closer to the road, and the scent of pavement turned into the scent of damp leaves and distant rivers. At the next stop, a mother and her young son boarded. The boy's face was hidden behind a cluster of floating balloons, red, blue, pink, and yellow. Claire couldn't help but smile. Something about it brought her back to the fair. She closed her eyes. She was 7 again, sitting on her dad's shoulders at the county fair, cotton candy in one hand, sticky and sweet. But it wasn't the pink fluff she remembered most. It was the little black licorice candies. They were strange and sharp, like secrets in candy form. Her dad always teased her for liking them. But she did. The rides spun in her memory. The Ferris wheel, the carousel with its creaking music and gold poles. She remembered being scared of the Ferris wheel once when she was very small. Her father had held her hand and said, "Claire, the wheel teaches us balance. When you're going up, think of the things that trouble you. When you come down, let them go. The ride does what life does." She had never forgotten that. The conductor approached, breaking her reverie. Claire handed over her ticket with a smile, then turned back to the window. Rain clouds had gathered in the sky, heavy and full. A sudden gust of wind slipped through the open crack of her window, carrying with it the smell of rain-soaked earth. It was the scent of memory, of play and puddles and bare feet on warm summer pavement. Claire leaned toward the glass. A few drops splashed her cheek. She smiled. The first rain of the journey had begun, and inside her, soft as the wind, slow as the dusk, memories began to unfold like petals in the dark. The rain fell like a silk ribbon, stretched across the sky. Droplets rolled down the glass, leaving streaks like watercolors in motion. Claire remained still, her head resting against the window pane, letting her thoughts drift with the rain. She wasn't trying to remember anything in particular, but rain always had a way of unlocking old memories, like turning a key to a room in the heart that one thought had long been shut. And this time, it brought her back to childhood, to rainy days from years ago. She could still see herself and Ryan, her younger brother, darting through the downpour. They didn't carry umbrellas. They weren't afraid of mess or cold. They leapt into puddles, laughed along stone paths, and raced paper boats down little streams running along the edges of the road. The boats were small, but to them, they carried entire imagined worlds. Their mother used to shout from the window towel in hand, calling them back. But even she would end up laughing at the sight of two mud-splattered, wide-eyed children. Days like that never lasted long, just a few minutes of rain and chaos. But the purity they left behind lasted forever. On the bus, the rain passed just as quickly. Only minutes later, the sun peeked through, once more golden and gentle, spreading light across the horizon. Now the bus rolled past rice fields, their yellow stalks glowing in the sun's farewell. Claire gazed out and thought the stalks looked like they were bowing to one another, swaying with the evening wind. Sunlight warmed her cheek through the glass. It felt like a hand brushing softly across her face. She closed her eyes. The scenery blurred behind her eyelids, but another world opened, a world of flowers. The bus drifted by rows of sunflowers, lilies, and daffodils. The sunflowers towered so close to the window that Claire could see the striped bees buzzing busily over their petals. Butterflies fluttered too, in colors so vivid they seemed to belong to another realm entirely. A breeze swept in, carrying the fragrance of the blossoms. Claire breathed in deeply, catching the rich scent of pink, white, and purple lilies. It was intoxicating, pure, tender, sacred. It smelled like life itself, and something else too, something unspoken. The bus slowed as it approached a narrow bridge over a winding river. Claire shifted slightly to catch a glimpse of a family of ducks swimming in perfect line. One duckling was bright white, standing out against its yellow siblings. Claire's eyes lingered on it. It looked like a tiny pearl bobbing on water. She imagined she was taking photos, with her eyes, each moment captured not on film, but stored in the quiet archive of memory. Moments like these couldn't be saved with a lens. Only the heart knew how to keep them safe. And Claire had collected many such memories. Whenever the world felt heavy or her spirit dimmed, she just had to close her eyes. Images would return of rain, sun a sparrow in her hand, and those quiet pieces of the past made her feel like she was floating, soft as air, light as a bubble. She sank deeper into her seat, breathing slowly. Her eyelids grew heavy. A soft yawn slipped out. Claire didn't resist it. She let the drowsiness pull her under like a lullaby, wrapping her in twilight. She slept like that peacefully, gently, until the bus slowed at a quiet roadside stop. The change in the engine's hum stirred her awake. Claire rubbed her eyes, still half dreaming. She turned to the window. The sky had turned black velvet, with stars beginning to blink into place like sequins stitched to a great tapestry. The moon was full and impossibly bright. Claire smiled softly. Another memory surfaced. As a child, she used to believe the moon followed her. No matter where she went, through woods, over fields, past rooftops, it always stayed with her, drifting silently above. On nights when her family returned home on their little scooter, Claire would sit in the back and watch the moon through treetops, over quiet ponds and sleepy hills. When they reached their street, she'd hop off and run the last stretch by herself, eyes locked on the sky. She'd laugh and shout, "Look, the moon's still with me." Now that she was older, she knew the moon wasn't hers alone. It was for everyone. But the feeling, that quiet sense of being seen, being accompanied, had never quite left her. Claire smiled again, because not all memories fade. Some stay light as moonbeams and guide you home through the dark. The moonlight poured like silver silk through the bus window, and Claire found herself once again lost in thought, suspended between sleep and wakefulness, between yesterday and now. The bus moved with a steady hum through flower-lined roads, and for a while, all she could see were petals glowing in the dark. She couldn't tell what kind they were, clearly not in the dimness, but some looked like roses, and that single glimpse pulled her gently into another memory, one that bloomed not too long ago. Each year, Claire attended the flower festival in her hometown. It was a tradition she kept like a soft ritual, a moment of pause in a busy world. There, inside the vibrant maze of colors and fragrances, she felt at peace. She loved all the flowers, but roses had always been her favorite. Last year's festival had been particularly unforgettable. Claire had arrived just as the sun dipped low, spilling golden light over the tents. The air was thick with scent carnations, lavender, honeysuckle. But she couldn't find the roses, not a single petal. She walked from stall to stall, hoping to catch even a trace of their fragrance. Overhearing two vendors talking, she paused. "The Rose Boys running late again," one said with a sigh. The Rose Boy, that's when it happened. A sudden jolt against her back knocked her slightly forward. She turned quickly, startled, only to find herself facing a young man pushing a cart overloaded with roses, hundreds, maybe thousands. The blooms spilled over each other in reds, whites, blush, pinks, and deep velvet purples. Some petals floated in the air like confetti. He looked flustered, breathless. "Oh, sorry. So sorry I didn't see you." Claire hadn't minded. Not at all. The scent was intoxicating, rich, wild, and somehow ancient. She closed her eyes for a second, letting it fill her lungs. When she opened them again, the young man was smiling at her, warm and sheepish. "I'm Jamie," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "The very late Rose guy." They stood there for a while, chatting beside the sea of blossoms. Everything around them seemed to quiet down. It wasn't romantic in the loud, dramatic way the world often imagined it. It was gentle, familiar, like recognizing someone you didn't know you were waiting for. Claire smiled now at the memory tucked in her seat on the bus, her fingers tracing invisible roses against the glass. She thought of Jamie's hands stained slightly red from rose stems. She thought of the way he'd looked at her, like she belonged in the scent and the silence. They'd met a few more times since then. Nothing grand, just coffee, a walk through the park. But something in her heart said it wasn't about how often they met, but how completely she felt seen when they did. Back on the bus, most of the passengers had drifted into sleep. A soft snore came from somewhere near the front. Claire looked around and felt a sense of hush fall over everything. The engine purred. The road whispered. Outside, the moon moved slowly behind a veil of clouds. Claire yawned a deep, soul-heavy breath and let her head fall back against the seat. Her eyelids closed naturally, like petals folding inward for the night. But instead of slipping into sleep, her mind wandered down the quiet hallway of thought. Why do some moments stay with us forever? A look, a scent, a stranger who becomes familiar. And why do others, days, even years, vanish without a trace? She thought of how memory worked, like light through leaves, casting patterns, highlighting random corners, while leaving others in shadow. You couldn't always choose what you remembered, but you could choose how you carried it. The memory of the roses. She carried that like a lantern. Claire's hand slipped to her violin case, resting beside her. She thought of music, not the notes, but the silence between them. The way a pause could say more than a crescendo. The way a single melody could pull tears from a heart that thought it had dried out long ago. Music was like memory, too. It stayed where it wanted to. It knew the shortcut to the soul. Her fingers twitched slightly, as if brushing phantom strings. She'd play again soon. Not on a stage, not for applause, just on a quiet street, somewhere where the air was soft and the world was listening without saying a word. Maybe Jamie would be there, or maybe not. It didn't matter. Some things were beautiful simply because they happened. As the bus rolled forward through the sleeping countryside, Claire let herself feel the weight of every small joy. The scent of roses, the gentle collision with a stranger, the quiet ache of memory that came without warning. Outside, the moon peeked out again, and inside, a girl who once searched for flowers, now found herself blooming. The sky was starting to soften, no longer cloaked in midnight, but shaded in that quiet in-between hue. Just before dawn spills across the world like honey. The engine's low hum and the rhythm of tires rolling over gravel stirred Claire from her light sleep. She blinked slowly, eyelids heavy, but heart calm. The countryside was still cloaked in silver mist. Dew clung to every blade of grass like tiny stars. The bus rounded a gentle bend, and suddenly, there it was, her hometown, a place stitched together by memory and rhythm, by routine and wonder. A town that knew her footsteps, her laughter, her quiet returns. A place that hadn't changed much, and yet somehow always felt new when she arrived. Claire adjusted her scarf, tucked a lock of hair behind her ear, and peered out the window. The first signs of morning danced across the rooftops. Smoky tendrils rose from chimneys. Lamps still glowed behind curtained windows. There was the bookstore where she had spent countless afternoons, curled up in the corner, with a novel she couldn't afford to buy, but always finished anyway. And there, yes, just up ahead, was the intersection where four roads met like old friends, leaning into each other. As the bus slowed to its final stop, Claire stood, gathered her satchel and violin case, and stepped out into the cool air. It smelled like fresh bread, morning fog, and something she could only describe as belonging. She paused for a moment. No rush. Let the morning find her. Across the street, the park was waking up. Joggers moved in steady rhythm past dewy benches. Children chased one another with sleepy glee, their laughter already echoing between the trees. The coffee shops were lighting their signs, opening their doors, sending the smell of espresso swirling into the open. Claire breathed it in like it was the first breath of her life. She stood perfectly still, letting the sights and sounds wrap around her like a favorite blanket. A street vendor adjusted the jars on his food cart, so precise in his movements, so deliberate in his artistry. She watched as he lit a small burner, steam rising, as if the air itself were sighing. Everything was moving, but nothing felt rushed. Across another corner, she spotted something familiar. The ice cream truck, bright, gaudy, absolutely wonderful. Painted in every color imaginable, it played a soft jingle that felt like childhood, wrapped in tinny music. Even at this hour, people were already lining up, parents, teenagers, sleepy-eyed workers, looking for a small joy before the day began. Claire smiled. Ice cream at sunrise. Why not? She thought of all the flavors inside that little truck: vanilla, strawberry, chocolate, mint blueberry, and her favorite butterscotch. It reminded her of her father, who once told her, "Life is like a freezer full of flavors. You won't love them all, but if you never try, you'll never know which one could have changed everything." Claire had always liked that. Life came in form, in swirls and sprinkles, in unexpected combinations. The good and the bitter, the soft and the strange. You didn't need to love them all. You just needed to taste them fully. She continued walking, feet knowing the path better than her thoughts did. As she turned into the main street market, her eyes caught the toy shop, small, wooden framed, with a little bell on the door that hadn't changed since she was 5. And suddenly, just like that, another memory opened inside her. She was a little girl again, standing at the window with wee eyes, hands pressed to the glass. Inside, there was a doll, round and rosy, with a red lace dress and eyes the color of turquoise seas. Her father had seen her gazing and bought it for her. Without saying a word, Claire had cried, not because she wanted the doll so badly, but because it had felt like love in its purest, quietest form. She had celebrated that doll's birthday like a real event, invited her friends, baked a rose-shaped strawberry cake with her mom, decorated paper goodie bags with glitter pens, and filled them with candies and home-baked cookies. Even now, she could almost taste the frosting, sweet, soft, touched with the scent of vanilla and joy. That doll still sat in her room beside her study desk, waiting. As Claire stepped closer to the toy shop, she saw a small girl inside, standing with her father, eyes wide and sparkling with that same innocent wonder. Claire didn't go in. She just stood quietly at the glass, watching. She didn't want to interrupt the magic, only to witness it, to honor it. She sighed, not with sadness, but with peace. Then she turned, walked on, and found herself on a quiet lane leading to a familiar fountain in the town square. Here she paused. This was the place. She knelt gently, unlatched her emerald violin case, and cradled the instrument like a secret waiting to be spoken. Her fingers moved with grace and memory. She stood slowly, lifted the violin to her shoulder, and closed her eyes. The first note rose into the dawn like prayer. The first note that rose from Claire's violin was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it carried like light across still water. She stood in the center of the town square, her shoes resting on cobblestones, still damp with dew. Around her, the world was waking. Coffee cups clinked. Laughter drifted out of cafes. But for a moment, as the sound of her strings unfolded, everything seemed to pause. It wasn't a performance, not really. There was no stage, no microphone, no applause waiting. It was just Claire, and the music, and the space between them. A quiet offering to the town that raised her, a gentle return to herself. Her fingers moved with ease, muscle memory dancing beneath them. The bow slid with grace, as if the violin had missed her too. Each note was a thread connecting the past to the present, stitching forgotten emotions back into place. People began to notice. First, an elderly woman who stopped mid-step, her grocery bag dangling from one wrist. Then a man in a business suit, coffee in one hand, phone forgotten in the other. A pair of school children slowed their bicycles, resting their feet on the ground to listen. Claire kept her eyes closed. She wasn't playing at them. She was playing with them, with the hum of the street, the heartbeat of the town, the hush of the morning, wrapped in mist. It all became part of the melody, a living harmony. She could feel herself floating, not above the crowd, but within it, as if her soul had stepped just slightly outside her body and was now weaving between passers-by, brushing shoulders, pressing palms, and whispering, "You are not alone." The tune was one her father used to hum an old folk song without words. Just rise and fall, hope and ache. Claire had once asked him, "What does it mean?" And he'd answered, "It means whatever your heart needs it to mean today." Today, it meant presence. It meant grace. It meant letting go of things she'd carried too long and remembering things she thought she'd lost. As she continued playing, more people gathered, not out of obligation, out of curiosity, out of something they couldn't quite name. Some stood still. Others sat along the fountain's edge. A toddler clapped. A teenager filmed it on her phone, eyes bright. But no one spoke. No one wanted to break the spell. Claire opened her eyes. The square had become a sanctuary, and she, without planning to, had become a vessel. She played one final note, held it in the air like a breath, and let it drift away. For a moment, there was silence. Then came the applause, gentle, surprised, genuine. Not loud, but full of warmth. Like morning sun on bare skin, Claire bowed slightly. Her cheeks pink, not from embarrassment, but from joy. She hadn't played in public for a long time. Not since before things had gotten messy. Not since she'd left the city. Not since she'd stopped believing her music mattered. But today, it had mattered because it had come from a place of stillness, of return. She placed her violin carefully back in its case, clicked the latch shut, and stood quietly for a moment longer. The crowd began to scatter, carrying the music with them in softened footsteps and lifted spirits. And Claire, she simply walked, no destination in mind, just the rhythm of her soles against familiar streets. She passed by storefronts still the same as they were years ago. The bakery, with its heart-shaped pastries in the window, the bookstore with the crooked sign, the shoe repair shop with faded lettering, but a bell that still jingled the same way it always had. Everything looked different, and yet utterly unchanged. It reminded her that places like people don't need to be perfect to feel like home. She turned the final corner onto her street. It was narrower than she remembered. The trees on either side had grown taller, their branches almost touching in the middle, like hands reaching to embrace. Shadows danced beneath them. Wind moved gently through the leaves. And then she saw it, her house, small with chipped white paint, and a porch that creaked in the summer. The windows caught the sunlight like mirrors, and on the front steps, standing just as he used to, was her brother, Ryan. His arms were crossed, his expression unreadable for half a second. Then it broke into the biggest, most boyish grin she'd ever seen. He came bounding down the steps, bare feet and all, and pulled her into a hug so tight her violin case nearly slipped. "You're finally home," he whispered into her hair. Claire laughed and maybe cried a little too. But she didn't mind. Some stories didn't need dramatic endings, just quiet arrivals, just arms that waited, just music echoing in the streets of the place that never forgot you. Claire stood at the threshold of the house she had once called her entire world. The porch creaked beneath her step, just like it always had, singing a familiar wooden lullaby. The screen door let out its little sigh as Ryan held it open, and the scent of home, earthy warm, touched with something like cinnamon, wrapped around her like a welcome home blanket. Inside, everything looked exactly the same, and completely different. The rug in the hallway had a new stain, probably coffee. The old clock still ticked too loudly. A pair of slippers, definitely not hers, rested by the kitchen door. And yet, in the bones of the house, in the light slanting through the windows, it all felt untouched. It felt waiting. Ryan watched her from the side, not saying much, just smiling in that way brothers do. Claire dropped her bags beside the coat stand and took a slow walk through the living room. The bookshelf was still overflowing. The little photo of their parents dressed in Christmas sweaters, eyes closed, mid-laughter, still stood beside the lamp. Her childhood piano, dusty but dignified, waited in the corner like a friend who never left. She placed her hand gently on its keys, not pressing, just remembering. "I thought you might want to rest first," Ryan said quietly. "Or we could eat." "I cooked," Claire turned, arching an eyebrow. "You cooked?" He shrugged. "Okay," I heated up. She laughed a real laugh, full and bright, and surprised by itself. They moved to the kitchen together. The table had already been set. 2 bowls of steaming soup sat ready along with bread still warm from the oven, and 2 chipped mugs of tea. Claire ran her fingers across the edge of the table, wooden slightly warped from time and memory. "This feels like time travel?" she murmured, taking her seat. Ryan grinned. "Good. That's exactly what I was going for." They ate mostly in silence, the kind of silence only shared by people who don't need to fill it. The soup was simple carrots, herbs, bits of potato, but comforting in a way only childhood recipes could be. Claire took her time, chewing slowly, letting every flavor root her back into the present. As she ate, her gaze wandered to the corkboard on the far wall. It was still covered in old postcards, family recipes, a few fading Polaroids from summers long past. There was one photo in particular, her at age 10, holding a sparkler in one hand and a giant slice of strawberry cake in the other. "Do you remember that birthday?" she asked, pointing. Ryan nodded. "Of course. The doll party." Claire's eyes softened. "She's still here, you know." "On the shelf." "I know," he said. "I dusted her last week." "Don't tell anyone." They both smiled. After dinner, Claire wandered back into her old room. She opened the door slowly, half expecting it to have shrunk in her absence. But no, it was just the same. The bed still wore its faded floral quilt. The lamp still leaned slightly to the left. Her books, her drawings, her trinkets, all still lived here, like nothing had moved since the last time she whispered goodnight to them. And there she was, the doll, sitting gracefully on the shelf by the study desk, dressed in her red lace dress, eyes still twinkling turquoise in the glow of the window light. Claire reached for her, cradling her in both hands like something sacred. She ran her fingers gently over the fabric, over the hair, now slightly frizzy with age. "I missed you," she whispered, and maybe the doll had missed her too. Claire sat on the edge of the bed, doll in lap, and let her eyes close. Her breath slowed, her heartbeat softened. All the noise of the world, buses and cities and broken things, seemed very far away now. This room, this moment, this silence. It was a song, all on its own. Outside, the evening light faded into blue. Somewhere down the hall, Ryan was washing dishes, humming a tune she didn't quite recognize. The sound of water clinking against porcelain mixed with the quiet creak of the house settling, and Claire in her room felt held, not just by the walls, not just by the past, but by the presence of love that asked for nothing, needed no performance, and expected only truth. She lay back against her pillow, the doll still in her arms. She stared up at the ceiling, where shadows moved gently, like memories dancing on tiptoe. She wasn't asleep, not yet. But she didn't need to be. This stillness, this comfort, was its own kind of dream. And tomorrow, there would be more. There would be walks and coffee and maybe a visit to the market. There would be stories, old friends, and perhaps even music in the park. But tonight, there was only this. A homecoming, not just of feet and suitcase, but of heart and soul. The morning sunlight spilled across Claire's face like a soft, golden cloth. She stirred slowly, eyes fluttering open, to a room bathed in warmth. The air smelled faintly of old wood lavender soap and toast from the kitchen. Her arms were still wrapped around the doll. She smiled. For a moment, she simply lay there listening. There was no city noise, no urgency. Only the distant sound of birds greeting. The gentle hum of a kettle boiling, and the occasional creak of the house stretching awake. Claire sat up and placed the doll gently back on the shelf. The red lace of its dress caught a sliver of sunlight, glowing like a memory made visible. She rose, stretched, and padded barefoot down the hall. Ryan was at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and flipping through a paperback that looked older than either of them. He glanced up and grinned. "You survived your first night back." Barely, she teased, grabbing a mug. "Your snoring nearly cracked the windows." He shrugged. "Still better than city traffic." They shared a quiet breakfast toast, eggs, berries, fresh from the market. Nothing extravagant, but perfect in its simplicity. Claire poured a second cup of coffee and stood by the window, watching light spill through the maple trees. "I think I'll go for a walk," she said. Ryan nodded. "Take your time. The town's still here." Claire smiled softly at that. She stepped outside and was greeted by air that felt brand new, cool, clean, wrapped in the scent of flowers and sun-warmed stone. The streets glistened with dew. The town moved slowly, like a dream not quite ready to be disturbed. Claire wandered without a plan, past the bakery, where loaves of bread sat in tidy rows behind fogged-up glass, past the post office, where a man in suspenders waved as he swept the steps, past the alley, where she and her childhood friends used to draw chalk murals on summer afternoons. Everything was quieter now, smaller, but in that smallness, Claire found something she hadn't known she was missing. Stillness, not the kind that feels empty, but the kind that feels full. Full of life, full of meaning, full of time. She turned down a side street that led to the river trail. The trees arched overhead, their leaves whispering in the breeze. Sunlight flickered through them like stained glass. Beneath her feet, the path crackled with gravel and fallen leaves. Her steps fell into rhythm with the rustle of branches and the soft murmur of the river nearby. She passed a bench where a little girl sat with her grandfather feeding crumbs to birds. She passed a dog walker with 4 dogs. each one pulling in a different direction, tails wagging in glorious chaos. She passed 2 elderly women sitting on a low stone wall, exchanging stories between sips of tea from thermoses. Claire didn't stop, but she took it all in. Noticing was enough. Eventually, the path curved and opened into a meadow on the riverbank. The grass was tall, the breeze constant, the wild flowers scattered like constellations across the green. Claire sat down, pulled her knees to her chest, and exhaled. She closed her eyes, and there it was, that feeling again. The feeling of being both incredibly small and endlessly held. The hum of the earth, the quiet applause of leaves, the murmur of water moving through stone. It was music. It was memory. It was God, perhaps, if not in name, then in nearness. Claire let herself feel everything, the ache of time, the beauty of return, the gentle grief that sometimes comes not from sadness, but from realizing how long you've gone without pausing to notice your own soul. She stayed there until the shadows shifted, until the sun touched her cheek, like a friend nudging her forward. She stood, slowly brushing grass from her skirt, and made her way back along the trail. As she walked, she felt lighter, not because anything had changed, but because she had. Sometimes healing doesn't arrive as a thunderclap. Sometimes it's just a morning like this, a quiet breath, a walk with no destination, a field of wildflowers reminding you that your heart can bloom again. Back in town, she stopped by the flower shop. Rows of blooms lined the front porch. Daisies, lilies, tulips, and yes, roses. The scent of them made her pause. She reached for a single rose, deep red petals, curled like silk thorns, delicate but real. She paid with a smile and carried it with both hands as she walked. Passing the coffee shop, she saw Jamie, not in some grand, choreographed way, just there, sitting outside, sipping something warm, flipping through a notepad. He looked up. Their eyes met. No rush, no script, just the softest smile, like he'd been waiting without realizing it. Claire stopped for a moment, then walked over, not because she had to, but because this day, this walk, this moment had opened something in her, a door she hadn't knocked on in a long, long time. Claire sat across from Jamie at the cafe's sidewalk table, her rose resting between them. In a small jar of water the barista had kindly provided. They didn't talk right away. They didn't need to. The town moved around them like a soft current. Bells rang from the corner chapel. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. People passed with smiles and to-go cups, and the hush of a morning too good to rush through. Jamie stirred his drink absently, then glanced up. "It's good to see you again," Claire smiled. You two. There were years behind those words. Missed moments. Paths that had curved apart. But here they were, sitting in a place where time had thinned, where two people could meet again without needing to explain why they'd once drifted. I almost didn't come home, Claire admitted. Jamie tilted his head slightly. Why not? She looked at the rose. I think I forgot what it meant. To belong somewhere. To let myself pause. Breathe. Remember, he nodded. Sometimes the world gets so loud, we forget how quiet can feel like truth. Claire blinked slowly, the words sinking in. They talked for a while. About small things. About nothing, really. But in that nothing, something shimmered. Familiarity, curiosity, possibility. When she finally stood to go, Jamie walked her down the street, past the market, and toward the heart of town. At the old fountain, they paused. The water sparkled in the sun, catching glints of light and tossing them back like tiny stars. Claire held her violin case in one hand, the rose still in the other. Jamie looked at her, soft-eyed. Will you play again sometime? Claire smiled. I will. He didn't ask when. He just nodded, like a promise had been made and kept. They said goodbye without drama. Just warmth. Just two people parting gently like pages turning at the right time. Claire walked the rest of the way home alone, but she wasn't lonely. Each step felt deliberate. Each breath deeper. She noticed the curve of the road beneath her feet, the birds calling to one another across rooftops, the neighbor's wind chime swaying in the morning breeze. Back at the house, Ryan was reading on the porch. He looked up and grinned. That rose suits you. Claire twirled it slowly. I think it's mine. He made a spot for her beside him, and together they sat in comfortable silence, watching the town stretch into the afternoon. The air was warm, the kind that coaxed you into stillness. Not laziness, but presence. Claire glanced at her violin case. Then she opened it. I'm going to play, she said simply. Ryan raised a brow. Here, she nodded. Here. She stood on the porch, placed the violin on her shoulder, and lifted the bow. The first note was quiet, barely louder than the breeze, but it carried through the trees, across the fence, into the windows of neighbors who stopped what they were doing just to listen. This time, Claire played not for strangers or for memory. She played for herself, for the little girl who had once believed the moon followed her, for the teenager who found comfort in quiet songs on stormy nights, for the woman who had wandered far only to find the truest journey was the one that led her back to the stillness she'd once called home. The music rose, and with it came a feeling that couldn't be put into words. Not joy, exactly. Not nostalgia. Something deeper. Something softer, like gratitude, like grace. Ryan didn't say anything. He just listened, and somewhere down the road, someone opened their window. A child stood barefoot on the grass, frozen by the sound. An old man set down his cane and smiled at nothing in particular. When the song ended, Claire lowered her bow and took a long, slow breath. The air tasted different now, brighter, freer. She sat back down beside Ryan, who offered her the last sip of his lemonade. "I think you just woke the entire block," he said. Claire laughed. "Good. Maybe they needed waking." They stayed there as the sun dipped lower shadows, stretching across the porch like fingers reaching toward dusk. Later, after dinner, after stories, after the last cup of tea, Claire found herself once again in her old room. She lit a small candle, set the rose in a jar beside her bed, and lay down beneath the soft quilt. Outside, the world kept turning, but inside, everything was still. Claire closed her eyes, and in that moment, in that breath between days, she didn't think about what came next. Not the future, not the unknown. She just rested, wrapped in memories. Yes, but also in peace, because home isn't always a place. Sometimes it's a moment, sometimes it's a song, and sometimes it's simply knowing you are exactly where you're meant to be, with nothing left to fear. And so, the girl came home. Not just to the house she once knew, but to herself. The self that once felt tired, distant, and lost in the noise of everything else. Through music, memory, and unspoken love, Claire found what mattered most, peace. Because sometimes you don't need to go far to find healing. You just need to be still and let your heart remind you you were loved all along. Thank you for joining us on tonight's journey. If something in your soul feels a little softer now, if your heart feels like it's been gently held, then maybe you've just come home too. Sleep well, and we'll see you again in another dream.